Thank you very much. Our second witness is Mr. Knapp. Mr. Knapp co-founded the South Carolina Small Business Chamber of Commerce in February of 2000 and serves as its president and CEO. He also serves as co-chair of the American Sustainable Business Council Action Fund and is the president of the Knapp Agency, an advertising and public relations firm. Mr. Knapp, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chairman Risch. Thank you, Chairman Risch, Ranking Member Shaheen, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I'd like to start with some facts. Most regulations affecting small businesses come from local and state governments. According to polling by the American Sustainable Business Council, 86% of small businesses believe that regulations are necessary, and 93% believe their business can live with fair and manageable regulations. Regulations aren't killing the economy. Tens of thousands of new jobs are being created every month. In February, South Carolina had the largest one-month increase in the number of people working. Regulations level the playing field with big business and protect small businesses from unfair competition. Regulations create opportunity for entrepreneurs and small businesses to innovate and grow by creating new products and services requiring new jobs. And small business owners care about their families, neighbors, workers, communities, and environment, which they want to keep safe and healthy, the goal of regulations. So how are small businesses involved in the regulatory development process? Both the Regulatory Flexibility Act and the Small Business Regulatory Enforcement Fairness Act give small businesses impacted by proposed regulations the opportunity to weigh in on the regulation development process to let federal agencies know how their businesses would be impacted and encourage modifications to make the regulations less burdensome. This process isn't serving our small businesses very well. It takes years and years to promulgate a rule. Small businesses across this nation really aren't having input into the regulatory decision-making process. The process has been taken over by powerful, often big business special interest groups with their own agenda and have given us regulatory paralysis. Now, how do small businesses confront federal regulations that are of concern to them? They can personally contact the federal agency to ask for clarification or help in compliance. The more effective approach would be to contact the Office of the National Ombudsman and ask for assistance in trying to resolve their regulatory issue with a federal agency. Unfortunately, just as the regulatory decision-making process isn't serving small businesses well, compliance assistance is also inadequate. Here are my recommendations for regulatory reform that will actually benefit our small businesses. Balance the balance sheet. Why do we never see the benefits of regulations in any agency analysis? The positive side of the ledger is always blank when the potential impacts of regulations are analyzed. The economic, health, and social benefits of rules put in terms of dollars is not considered by the Office of Advocacy and the regulatory agencies. We often hear critics say that government should run more like a business. Well, businesses weigh the benefits versus costs when making a business decision. No business would invest in new equipment if they only considered cost. Whether the absence of analyzing the benefits of a regulation in the formal process is by statute or custom, this must change if we are to get truly accurate data for rulemaking decisions and give the public complete information about the value of regulations. Invest in better outreach and analysis. We've essentially starved the regulatory agencies and advocacy, while at the same time wanting them to do more. But that can't happen. Small business outreach is primarily to Washington insiders who want to clog up the regulatory process through heavy lobbying, litigation, creating public anxiety by quoting huge bogus costs. Then the reform proposals that get the most attention fix the wrong problems and would just make more problems. The RFA process we have today simply needs more resources so it can run more effectively and efficiently. Give the agencies the resources to conduct a quality rulemaking analysis and outreach we all want. Final point. Help small businesses understand the rules and provide compliance assistance. Once a rule has been finalized, the job of the federal government is not done. Small businesses need to be educated about the new rule and, when necessary, provided regulatory compliance assistance. Congress has also set up a process for this, not only within every regulatory agency, but also through the SBA Office of the National Ombudsman. Where the Office of Advocacy works on the front end of a development of a significant regulations, the Office of the National Ombudsman is charged with helping small businesses on the back end with all regulation compliance. It serves as the conduit for small businesses to have their grievances about compliance problems or other issues with federal agencies heard directly by the agencies in an effort for successful resolution. In this way, the Office of the National Ombudsman and the agencies can detect patterns of compliance problems so that the agencies can revisit rules for modification. This important component of the rulemaking process is woefully underfunded. The Office of the National Ombudsman actually relies on volunteers to help get the message out about its vital small business services. It is, for the most part, unknown and underutilized. If Congress really wants to help small businesses with federal regulations, invest more in the small business outreach, support, and feedback loop. In conclusion, the current regulatory process can produce good rules while protecting small businesses from unnecessary burdens if we provide the adequate resources for agencies to expeditiously carry out the requirements Congress has already put in place on the front end and the back end of the process. Most regulatory reform proposals, while achieving the agenda of some seeking to delay and stop regulations, will inevitably fail to help the vast majority of small businesses. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today, and I welcome any questions the committee might have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Knapp. What we're going to do now is do a 5-minute briefly and say, Mr. Knapp, thank you for coming here and providing your view of this. I have to say that you're using the statistics you did at the beginning is impressive. It's the best face I've ever seen put on this disaster. I've met morticians who couldn't do nearly as well as you did. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
With that, I want to yield to the ranking member. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and again, thank you both for being here. Mr. Knapp, I want to follow up because you talked about the outreach by federal agencies is not focused on small businesses, but it's really focused more on Washington insiders. How would you like to see us address that concern?
Well, yeah, the law does say that that the agencies can get representation from whole organizations, trade associations, and they're in Washington. It would be great if we could get them out into the to the outlying areas in each of your districts and hold these types of meetings. I think it's often what will happen is small businesses in a trade association or other organization at the ground level, may do things differently or have a different opinion or even help solve the problem. But that's not necessarily the goal at the national level and in D.C. Often trade associations, especially big ones, have their own agenda. And that's not necessarily to help the people at the local level. So I would like to see them out more, having more meetings, and actually engage in others like Ms. Noel. And home builders do a great job. I mean, don't get me wrong, I've known home builders in South Carolina, and they're very active, and they do a good job of communicating with their members. Not all business organizations are like that, and certainly not every small business belongs to a trade association as powerful as the Home Builders Association. I certainly would share Mr. Noel's concern that if information is being conveyed at the local level and it's sort of not filtering or getting into the final, but again, I am not going to attribute motive to the people for doing that. I will also attribute the fact they're short-staffed and there's not enough money to do it. So I appreciate what you're saying, but there might be a different reason.
I want to point out that according to Thumbtack's 2015 Small Business Friendliness Survey, New Hampshire ranks second as the second friendliest state in the country. Idaho is not far behind at number 6 for Senator Risch. But you talked, Mr. Knapp, about the percentage of regulations that are done at the state and local level and the challenges that they present. Are there ways in which we at the federal level can try and work with our local and state partners to try and address regulations so that we're not overlapping on regulations and so that we're maybe working together in a way that's more business friendly? Initiatives like Startup in a Day that the National League of Cities has launched is one of the things that may try and work through some of those regulations, but do you have other ideas?
Well, I don't know that I mean, there's something that would have to be considered, but I will tell you that from having started small businesses, that the most regulations you run into at the local level, local and state level. And that doesn't mean there's not going to be a federal regulation along the line, but the first obstacles are always at the local level. Working with the states and their regulatory process, I honestly don't know how that would work out. Everybody's got their own proprietary concerns. And that would really take a lot more effort to do that. And I don't know that the states would be interested.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Gene. Senator Kennedy, you're up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank both of you for coming. I enjoyed your presentations. Mr. Knapp, could you, in 30, I'm not quite sure I understood your point. That's probably my shortcoming, not yours. But in 30 seconds or less, could you tell me what you're advocating?
I'm sorry, what am I advocating?
Yes.
I'm advocating that our present regulatory process could work if it was properly funded. I really don't think that we're giving enough resources to the agencies and to advocacy to do the job that they are trying to do. And I'm also on the back end. You know, we need to set aside, if we had never had another regulation ever passed in this country, we got a ton of them on the books, don't we?
I get it. I understand.
And that we need to be helping those who are experiencing the present regulations. If they have compliance assistant issues, we ought to be helping them.
So you think an ombudsman can cure all this?
Well, again, the National Ombudsman in the SBA's office, that's what they're already charged with doing, is being that conduit. If somebody contacts their office saying, I have an issue with this compliance on this regulation, the ombudsman,
Mr. Knapp, excuse me for interrupting. I know what an ombudsman does, and I mean to cut you off, but I've only got 5 minutes.
Okay, sir, I apologize. But it's a different office. It's not the same as the agencies.
I want to be sure I understand what you're saying. That the answer to what I believe is the overregulation in America, which is extraordinarily burdensome, the answer to too much government is more government.
Mm-hmm. In this case, if you want to help resolve the problem, let's make sure the system that you have in place is properly funded.
Okay. Well, it's also been my experience, it's not just, and I'd like both of you to comment on it, it's not just the number of rules and regulations, and it's not just the complexity. I think that you'll find this to be accurate, that the federal rules generally are much more complex than state and local. It's also an attitude. I mean, we need government workers who answer the telephone, and when they do answer the telephone, try to be helpful, which means making a decision. Mm-hmm. Now, I know the safest way not to get in trouble is not to make a decision, but it kind of frustrates business. Business women and businessmen are used to making a decision. It's government websites that a normal person can navigate. I guess what I'm talking about is not just the number of rules, which is breathtaking, particularly the amount added in the last 8 years. It's not just their complexity. It's not just the extraordinary expense. It's the attitude of the agencies. I mean, not every time, but too often you just encounter condescension and smugness and this unspoken understanding that if you complain too much, well, what goes around comes around. Would you comment on that?
Oh, I will say that you have just simply made the perfect argument for having some entity like the National Ombudsman's Office to be that conduit, to be the entity that goes to those federal agencies and say, you will talk with these people, you will try to resolve this problem. That's what they're empowered to do, sir.
I'm out of time.
Knapp, first of all, thank you both for being here today. In South Dakota, like in 41 other states, we have a rules review process. The federal government does not have one, at least not one that works. At the federal level, the Congress will create a law, allow the executive branch, the administrative authority, to write the rules, but there is no requirement, as Mr. Knoll has indicated earlier, that ever be reconciled with the actual law itself, unless at the cost of a small business person or a business person someplace, that agency is sued. It seems to me that the best way to approach this is to have a rules review process in place at the federal level, just like we have in 41 other states. Can I ask each of you if you would agree that that would be an appropriate way to handle the rules processes in the future, and would that actually help us solve this problem?
In fact, in 2002, I was part of the group that promoted the South Carolina passing their flexibility, Small Business Flexibility Act. That's on the front end, though. So there's a volunteer group that looks at every rule promulgated by a state agency, and if they got problems with it, they take it back to the state agency and say, fix this. So that's worked exceptionally well in South Carolina. Your proposal regarding having an independent entity look at a rule to make sure it complies with what the legislation said, I have not looked into that.
Actually, I have another question as well. Do you think, would either one of you think that it's appropriate for the agency responsible for enforcement and action, do you think they should fund their agency using the fines that they collect?
It creates a perverse incentive to finding problems when you do it that way. But I imagine those agencies have been told by Congress maybe they have to be self-funded.
Let me ask another question very quickly. If right now we have at the federal level, we have, as you've indicated and as the chairman's indicated, probably 80,000 rules in the books today. We have 1 million, or there's 80,000 a year. We have 1 million rules on the books today. The total cost to the American public today is about $1.9 trillion annually just to comply with the rules. And if you compare that, put it in numbers that people could actually understand, personal income taxes actually cost the American public on April 15th about $1.4 trillion. So the actual cost to the American economy on an annual basis is $500 billion more than what personal income taxes are to the individuals who actually own those businesses. It seems to me that if those rules were reviewed on a regular basis, that we'd have fewer of those, there'd be more dollars to the bottom line, there would be more revenue generated on actual profits delivered, and you'd actually have some happier business people and you'd have happier consumers as well. Your thoughts, gentlemen?
About that 1.9 trillion figure, I think that was produced by a study for advocacy, which later was disavowed by SBA. So I'm not sure about the number.
Probably higher.
But the look back thing is there's nothing wrong with that. In South Carolina, that Regulatory Flexibility Act says yes, they should go back and look at the rules to see if they're still appropriate or need to be modified. The problem with that is it takes money to do that. And again, I just don't think we're funding the process well enough to do that, which we may all agree with.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for giving me an opportunity to ask a few questions. I was just over at another committee, and so I think it's always important. Small business obviously is the cornerstone of American business, but it is particularly important in North Dakota. And so I take the role on this committee quite seriously and always appreciate the work that the chairman does in a very nonpartisan way to
Thank you, Senator. We've had a really good, robust discussion of regulations here
Good.
today. I think it's
Well,
been good.
I'll have to watch it on YouTube. I'm sure it was so interesting, it'll probably make the nightly news.
It might have 3 views.
I've been working, when I talk to North Dakota small business, I think they continue to be really concerned about regulatory burdens and how do we kind of overcome those. But I know that a lot of this ground's been covered. And so I want to say where I believe it's always important to consider actual consequences of proposed legislation. And so I want to ask both of you if you worry that legislation which adds analytical requirements which cause regulatory delay, whether that's going to be a problem for small business, because a lot of what we hear is not just the regulation itself, but the uncertainty and the delay in finding out what the rules are going to be. And so I ask that question of both of you. Randy, maybe you could start.
Well, thank you, Senator. Welcome. Uncertainty is really, really an issue for any business, small or large. How can they make a decision on what they're going to do if they don't know what the rules are going to be 2 years from now, 4 years from now, 5 years from now? So anything that doesn't improve the system and simply adds more time, more delay, is not a way of addressing the problem that we all agree that there are problems. So yes, that would be my response. If you're going to do something that is going to actually help fix a problem and it delays it a little bit, okay. But if it's simply going to delay, to stall, to wait for a new administration to do something, then we're not helping anybody.
Okay. Randy?